were going to talk a little bit about your journey to this field and how it was a little non-traditional. So
Yeah, so just ask me, how did I get to this point? How did I get into this field? And then I can go from there.
okay. Okay, so we've got the recording going. We usually give it a few seconds to give the intro some space when we start the show. And we are on episode 14. All right.
I graduated from UT also, so I appreciate your contribution. I worked a lot with the RAs, so.
The RA, the
yeah.
Resident.
Well, we had like research assistants and teaching assistants.
Oh, okay, okay.
All right, I'm going to start here. Okay. Hi, and welcome to Sustainably Geeky, episode 14. Today, I am joined by Jen.
Hi, guys.
She's back, and we've got a special guest today, Dr. David Trossman.
Not that special, but yeah.
We are today on this show. We really appreciate him being on the show, not only because he had to jump through many technical hoops to get here. We've had some technical difficulties, but also because he has agreed to do not only the show, but also speak to the Syntex Planeteers group that I run later this year. So I really appreciate your time and your willingness to share your knowledge with us. So Dr. Trossman is a research associate at UT Austin for the Odin Institute for Computational Engineering and Sciences. And I'm going to let him kind of explain what that means and how he got to this point in his career, the path that he took.
Okay. Thanks for having me on, Jennifer. Right now, I would refer to myself as a computational physical oceanographer, or ocean data scientist. And so I took the route of physical oceanography. I'll explain what that is in a moment. It just means it's the physics of the ocean, how the ocean moves, the heat and salt in it, wave physics, things like that, the ocean's role in climate. And so I got there by I don't know. It's kind of usual, kind of unusual route. I majored in math and physics. I thought I wanted to go on in physics, and then I stumbled upon the IPCC report from 2001. They make a report every 5 or 7 years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they ever since the early 90s. And one just came out last fall about 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees Celsius warming. But these were more general, just the state of climate science. And the one that I read in 2001, they barely mentioned the ocean. They just knew that it was uptaking a lot of heat, and that's about all they knew, according to the summary for policymakers. So I thought there was a niche in there. So I Google searched ocean climate Seattle. I was very specific. And the first thing that came up was the program on climate change. I applied for it. They flew me out. I met my future advisor, and that was that. I was set on going. And so then I just went through that, and I did 2 postdocs. Right now, I'm in, I don't know if it's the end point, but I'm kind of in the middle of making my way around the entire country. So I went from Seattle to Ann Arbor to Montreal to DC to Austin. I'm almost, it seems like it's in my future to go to the West Coast, I guess, again, if I complete the circle. But then I landed here, and I have to get my own funding for the most part, and so you just apply to government institutions in order to be paid. It's not a life everyone wants, not in it for the money. despite what a climate skeptic might say, I can't get any more money than the university says I can get anyway. Yeah. So I mean that's kind of the qualification process, but there's a lot of so the way that I landed on oceanography I mentioned, but not a lot of people make the connection between the ocean and just how we experience what we experience in our lives on land. And I don't know, it did. So what do you, Jennifer, think the relevance of the ocean is if you're a landlubber? So if you're in the middle of the mountains in Colorado, why does the ocean matter?
Well,
you're the one asking me questions. You're supposed to, I guess.
Right. So I'll start by saying I first, well, I guess my big fascination with the ocean, I've always been drawn, to different aspects of the ocean and studying it. But I actually read Sylvia Earle's book, The World is Blue, last year, and that really opened my eyes to a lot of the importance of the ocean, the things that it does for us, and also the threats that humans and climate change are posing to the ocean and the life forms in it. So I would say, what I got most out is not only the fact that it is responsible for a lot of the oxygen in the world, it harbors a lot of life, it sequesters a lot of carbon, and ultimately, it's really one of the most important things to our planet's survival are the oceans. I know that's a very broad statement, but
it's true. I mean, our survival is dependent upon many finely tuned factors. I mean, people studying the habitability of planets are amazed just that we exist. I mean, there's this narrow band of habitability. Not just the distance from the sun, but also whether your planet has water, whether it convex enough to produce clouds. You need cloud coverage on a lot of planets in order to potentially harbor life, if not all. Which I wouldn't have expected, but a lot of studies are coming out about that. And the ocean is really important in being able to regulate the planet. So that, and you're right. So it produces over half the oxygen. It takes up about 30% of the carbon dioxide that we emit, and it's taken up over 90% of the heat that's been accumulating on Earth because of greenhouse gases, things like the carbon dioxide that we're emitting, and that stays in the atmosphere.
So, Jen, did you want to jump in with anything?
I was just going to say, I think for the average person, especially in America, thinking about these global issues can be a little overwhelming at times. And so I do my best to try to bring it back a little bit and just say to your question originally is, if I'm in the mountains in Colorado and I like to ski and, I don't really care about the ocean so much, my response to you might be is, I like seafood. So if there's something wrong with the ocean and I can't have seafood any longer, then that could just be something that affects the average person that enjoys having that ability
sure.
to eat and have the availability to eat, healthy, happy seafood, not these sustainably grown farms, if you will. So the farm raised seafood and all of that. So yeah, so that was my response to your question. I think just so we can get clarity on this show a little bit, I think a lot of people just want to know what they can do to be a part of the solution to some of these global problems. So if we can just keep that in mind as we move forward on the conversation. A lot of times it can be a little hard to grasp like these major problems, and just mentioning things to the general public that they can do to try to help might be something that we can talk about today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So a source of food is definitely one important thing that all landlubbers appreciate, or even people who are at sea most of the time. So. Um, uh, fisheries are affected by various factors that have been changing, like the fact that we're putting out carbon dioxide that gets into the ocean. I said 30% of what we emit, basically, and that's because of chemistry. That's increasing how acidic the waters are. All it takes is, you don't even need to believe in the arguments about temperature changes due to greenhouse gases. Just the fact that carbon dioxide is going into the atmosphere, some of it gets into the ocean, that is going to make it more acidic because it turns into carbonic acid. And so that's affecting a lot of organisms to make their shells if they're made out of certain minerals. Those minerals, when those life forms die, go down to the bottom of the ocean sometimes, and that forms the seafloor. The sand on the seafloor, the sediment, that comes from those biological life forms. They're made out of calcium carbonate. So that calcium carbonate dissolves when you have more acidic water. So some skeptics will say, well, the ocean is not acidic, and it still isn't, and that's technically true because the pH is above 7. The pH is actually well above 7, but it's actually getting lower and lower, which means more and more acidic. And it's been measured. It's been measured that it's been getting lower everywhere we've measured it. So.
Okay.
So then there are other things, to connect that with fisheries. So that just the inability to make those shells for certain light forms, that impacts the ecosystem. And so people have noticed that when those organisms are impacted, that impacts ultimately fish that we eat. And so I've heard even the NASA program manager say that he's pretty concerned about seafood being at the table in a few decades.
So again, to bring it back to what Jen said and what you're explaining, not only does the ocean affect our planet and our ability to live on it, but bringing it home, it affects the food we are able to eat and also the economy, because the seafood industry is $1 billion something industry, and a lot of people's livelihoods depend on that. A lot of tourism dollars go into those activities. So when we're thinking about why should we keep the oceans healthy, if nothing else, if you don't believe in climate change and the other things that go along with it, think about the fact that it will affect the economy and your ability to eat certain foods. And I want to kind of touch real quick on this, just so people understand. You mentioned the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius shift in the oceans. What exactly does that mean? Why is that important for regulating the planet's climate, and why should we be concerned? Because I think a lot of people hear 2 degrees and they don't understand, first of all, that's Celsius, so that they have much bigger margins between their degrees, but also why does it matter? It gets warmer.
Yeah. So when you hear those numbers, that's a global average, and you have to keep in mind that the equatorial regions, so the very low latitudes near Peru, Brazil, parts of Africa, etc., those are going to change in temperature by less, but they are more sensitive to those small changes. So places like India right now, their water cycle is being disrupted, not only by us, but also by the change in climate. Places like Syria, Venezuela, etc., they're all going through water crises. So the temperature on the planet is related to the water cycle, and the ocean, of course, plays a very important role in that. Also, the 2 degrees, just to give some context, that's basically the difference in temperature between an ice age and now. So if you just lowered the global average temperature by 2 degrees from what it was in the late 1800s, if you lowered it by 2 degrees, you would have an ice age. The planet seems very sensitive when you think about it in terms of these small numbers. But also 2 degrees, like I said about the equator, they experience less than that. But what parts of the world experiences more than that? Everywhere else. So the Arctic is going to see the largest changes. And that's really unfortunate because there's a lot of sea ice and other ice on land to reflect the radiation. And if there's less of that, there's less reflection. And so there's more heat being absorbed by the Earth. And so
it's just a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and so you warm even more then. I mean, it's not a runaway feedback because of the response of other parts of the Earth system like clouds. And also the fact that we shoot up aerosols into the atmosphere, that actually partially offsets the warming. But we don't like breathing in those aerosols, so it's kind of a pro and a con.
Well, the other thing, when it comes to glacial melt or ice melt, that puts more water in the ocean, which raises the sea level, right? And
yeah,
that's when you see more flooding, specifically along, coastal areas. Also, it reduces the amount of fresh water, or I guess ice is water frozen, but it reduces that. So then you have more salt water in the world, and you're kind of stuck with that, issue of that's not really very usable to humans unless you do a lot of treatment to it. So,
yeah. So sea level, that's an extreme. I think it's becoming the most important issue. I mean, I just sorry, I'm gonna digress for a moment, and then I'll get back to sea level. But I was just listening last night to someone talk about the most important reasons people think that we should do something about the changing climate. So here's what they said. They said, provide a better life for our children and grandchildren. That's the #1 reason. Improve people's health. Save many plants and animal species from extinction. Protect God's creation. And save many people around the world from poverty and starvation. So I don't even think that hits upon one of the most important aspects of the changing climate, which is sea level, and that sea level is going to make as many as 200 million people by the end of the century have to move. In the U.S. alone, it's estimated to be 13.1 million.
wow.
And it's all along the coast. There are certain hot spots like Miami, New Orleans, San Francisco, New York City, Norfolk, Virginia. Actually, Northeast Houston.
Yeah, and some of those places are already experiencing daytime flooding, right? Where the water
Right.
comes in through their gutters, and it's like,
They find octopuses in the middle of the parking lot. Yeah.
oh wow, poor things.
And so the if you're living in the middle of the mountains in Colorado, how does the ocean impact you if there's sea level rise? Well, people are going to be moving to your city.
Nobody wants that.
You're not unaffected by sea level rise. You think you are high up in the mountains, but you're not.
Yeah, there's some interesting maps that show kind of a time lapse of what the world will look like in 10, 20, 50, 100 years if we don't stop sea level rise. And I mean, entire countries, entire states and cities will be underwater. It's kind of terrifying. A lot of Italy, I think, would be gone. Just all these peninsula areas that we take for granted and they're historic, they won't be there if we don't do something to fix this.
So that
Yeah.
leads me to a question.
Okay.
What do you feel like is the solution? I mean, there's a lot of different options that get thrown around, but if you could just name like your top three options for what needs to happen to reverse this or prevent it from occurring, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, so the top three things that so the national climate assessment report that came out, it was kind of buried, and so it came out the day after Thanksgiving. They wanted to just sneak it out
I
there, but
remember that.
media noticed. So in that report, they outline, I believe I remember the top three. So the top three are uh, stop over or prevent overpopulation. So just reproduce responsibly. Adopt if you want to have a child and you don't mind that the child isn't your genetic relative, or just educate people who, or give some protection for people who have had more than replacing capacity, more than two. There are a number of different things, but it's a very unpopular topic, as you can imagine, because it sounds like you're guilting people who have had children, and that I don't think that's I don't think that's what people are trying to do at all when they bring it up in this context. It's that when you have more people, that's more people who need all the infrastructure, and they're going to be emitting the greenhouse gases by driving cars, by turning on air conditioners, eating, things like that. And so, I mean, the number one factor that they found in the report was stop overpopulation.
Wasn't there a big movement in the 70s or 80s to kind of manage population, and it was kind of an environmental discussion,
Right.
but it
Yeah,
obviously wasn't very.
People realized there was a limit to our consumption habits. I don't know if it was necessarily motivated by the warming world or a changing climate, but it was motivated by the fact that they noticed on the other side of the world people had very little resources and were starving, whereas people in the U.S. were able to indulge in buffets. So. So people wanted to be a little more responsible in that respect, and that movement kind of died out, probably because of the connotation that some people feel guilted, and then they have a backlash. But there are other methods that are very important. I mean, one of which is also something that has connotations and people might feel guilty about. Maybe even both others. So one of them that isn't so bad in that respect is that just fly in airplanes less, and also take public transportation. Just don't drive as much, or use a vehicle that emits less, like a motorcycle or electric cycle or electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle. There are a lot of different options, and it's unfortunate that a lot of the different cities, even in this country and all over the world, don't have sufficient public transportation that more people don't take it. For example, in Austin, I saw that just 4% ride public transportation.
Wow.
I take it to work and back every day, and it's packed, the buses. And you would not think that only 4% of the city takes it, but apparently that's what the surveys found. And that 74% of the city, one person per car on their way to work.
It's really sad how this country specifically is so, just one-minded about using single-use, excuse me, vehicles. We're all about the personal car and the highway and the interstate, and we're not as impressed with the mass transit like they are in other countries that are forced to use it because they are limited in space. And it's just very unfortunate that we're behind.
I mean, I've lived half cities that had virtually no public transportation infrastructure and half in cities with amazing public transportation. Cities like DC, Chicago, Seattle, Montreal, those were great in terms of getting around without a car. I didn't need a car in those cities. But then others, I do need it here sometimes.
You don't want to have to drive it in those cities either. It's awful.
I've never enjoyed driving, but and so there's one last factor. This is another controversial one, is just eating less meat. Just because it takes so many resources, especially water, to grow a pound of beef effectively. It's beef in particular, so raising cows to be eaten. That's by far the worst one in terms of pollution and water resources. But so if people just reduced that consumption, it would have actually a large impact. But people are saying, well, would it really be because of the transportation of those resources to your plate isn't as bad as, say, the transportation of vegetables from the other side of the world that you want on your plate, et cetera. Things like chickpeas also are water intensive. And so vegetarians aren't necessarily low carbon in their diets if they're eating a lot of chickpeas. But one thing is known, that beef, if you eat less of it, there would be less emissions and probably more water to go around. But there are other things, but it's really unfortunate that people feel this guilt. Also, there are misinformation campaigns. Also, I mean, there are a lot of things. The speed at which climate is changing, there just are a lot of things that go against movements on trying to come up with a solution. I mean, individuals may not change their behaviors on their own. Also, I mean, economists would espouse that belief, that if meat was priced more expensively, then maybe we'd eat less of it. But then that impacts other markets like grains, etc. There's also government regulations. So they could say that you need the utilities need to come up with a certain amount of renewable energy. In certain states, you need this mix. So states are allowed to come up with their own optimal mix. Like in Nevada, maybe solar would be better. In Arizona, in Texas, we actually like wind. For the first time, we're producing more winds than more wind power than we're producing coal power.
Yay!
So I'm proud of Texas for that.
Yeah, I had a coworker that asked me about this show, and she wanted to know, like what she could do to help. And the first thing that popped in my head was to just tell her to conserve energy, you know, turn off the lights and regulate your air conditioner with a programmable thermostat. You know, these are things that are more, you know, palatable, I suppose. Right. And it saves them money on their electric bill. So we try to, you know, sell it in that regard. But yeah, I think there are some other things that can be done that maybe aren't as difficult or controversial.
Well, here's one. I don't think this should be controversial. Just waste less food. I mean, eat what's on your plate, and maybe don't eat a whole lot more than you need. I mean, that would utilize less resources, and there would be less associated emissions. The grocery stores would respond accordingly, according to what's being demanded of them. So if there might be, over a short period of time, while they're adjusting to new demands, there might be a bit of waste in the grocery stores just sitting on the shelves. But there should be mechanisms by which that supposedly wasted food goes to places like food pantries. So the food pantries should get that food, and then that gets used by people in need. There doesn't need to be so much wasted food. It's really astounding how much is wasted.
Yeah, we actually did a show on that a few months ago, and I think we talked about how about a third of it is wasted before it even gets to the consumer. It sits in the field, or it gets thrown away at the stores, and it's just appalling. Like, the amount that we're throwing away could feed some of these countries, like you mentioned, that don't have enough food. Not to mention, you know, as consumers, how much food do you throw away every week from just not paying attention or buying too much or letting it sit out and spoil or whatever. So I think that's something everyone can agree. You know, not only will that be an easy thing sort of to implement, but it will help save them money in the long run. So can see the benefit in that. Three things. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, there's, I mean, just big picture. We're talking about mitigation. There's also adaptation solutions. Adaptation solutions becomes a really cool conversation, but it cannot be by itself. So what I mean is, so mitigation is this large scale. Okay, let's attack the problem at its source. So let's, I mean, people have considered geoengineering, but let's put that aside because that's kind of, that's even more, that's one of the most controversial things to talk about with climate scientists. I mean, there really isn't a technique that is going to just solve the problem by itself. It might be in a transition period, maybe we shoot up aerosols to try to cool off the climate a little bit more, but that's about it. But mitigation is just trying to reduce the emissions, basically. And then adaptation, there's also, I mean, you can build really cool things. If you're an engineer, this is what you want to be doing for a living, potentially. There are things like climate scientists have come up with ways to block the ice shelf in Antarctica from melting and flooding into the ocean, so that it goes back to the continent and refreezes. So they've proposed, of course, a wall, and then, of course, they've said, and we're going to make the penguins pay for it. And there are also things like people have proposed just spraying water back on the continent, Antarctica, not just a wall, but spraying it onto the continent, and so the ice sheets get built up slowly again. And then we can also attack the problem here, just right on our coasts or in our backyards. There are a lot of different solutions for dealing with overheated cities, like you can reflect back more radiation. You can deal with water resource issues. You can people have proposed walls on coast to deal with sea level, but that's not a very smart solution because water just will go around your wall. Are you going to build a wall around your entire continent? Probably not. So
Yeah, it's a temporary fix. I've also heard that there's research being done in reflective sand on the ice, reflective, I don't know if you'd call them bubbles or just things that you put in the water to float and kind of help, you know, keep the sun or reduce the sun's impact. So there's a lot of creative things going on. I don't know. I think maybe it'll take a little bit of everything, the mitigation and some of the creative engineering, but it definitely, one thing's for sure is it will take everybody kind of doing their part to adapt to this new reality because it's going to happen if we don't. You know, things are going to change for the worse, and I know everyone thinks if it's just me doing it, it's not going to make a difference, but if we all think that way, then nobody's going to do anything and it's not going to change. It's going to take everyone doing, you know, a little bit, and we'll see big results altogether, I think.
yeah, I mean, so some of the most powerful things that could happen, like I was alluding to earlier, is just changes in what things are priced and what is even supplied to us. Like if there's less resources for us to utilize, we will have to adapt. If there is less that we can buy because it's too expensive, we will have to adapt. People do not want to think about that because it's uncomfortable and might disrupt their lives. But there are even other things that governments and the international community can do, like renewable energy. I don't think that renewable energy should be very controversial. I mean, you can continue the same behaviors that you've had, essentially, just with, and even with the same kind of frameworks, but just using different energy power plants, and you use a different type of vehicle, like an electric vehicle. That alone, here I wrote a blog post about this, about how much that would save. So people have estimated that climate change could cost as much as $2 quadrillion by the end of the century. And putting in renewable energy infrastructure could save us almost 200 trillion of that.
Wow.
I mean, it's a no-brainer. Trying to implement more wide-scale renewable energy should not be controversial.
Unfortunately, they only look at the upfront costs versus the cost savings a lot of the time, and I think that's a problem with a lot of industries in this country. But you're right; it shouldn't be controversial. It shouldn't be political. If for no other reason than we are not going to have fossil fuels forever, like they are a non-renewable resource. We will run out someday. So why not start thinking of other ways to power our cars and lights and everything in our life that don't emit pollution as a side effect?
Yeah.
It's kind of a
so I mean, then we can get into. I mean, we've alluded to it a couple of times. The politics of it, and I don't know if I want to go. but I mean, one thing about this issue, though, that I have read that is that actually more than a majority agrees that the climate is changing and that we should do something about it. I mean, whether they say that humans are the cause, a little less, but still a majority say humans are the cause in the U.S. And so if our government leaders are saying that that it's a hoax, etc., then they're and scientists are now the most trusted. Science is now the most trusted profession in the U.S. So the combination of those statistics makes it really it seemed like our government leaders are not doing what the people want. But I mean, when have they? I guess I don't know, but I mean, they just lag a little behind until they realize that they're not voted into office again because they didn't listen to their constituents. So,
well, and hopefully
yeah,
folks
that's
do.
another. Voting is
Yeah.
very powerful. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, hopefully folks do exercise their right to vote folks out that are not doing things in our best interest, because not only environmentally, but there are other things happening in the country and in the world that, you know, our government leaders aren't always listening to their constituents on. And if there's an issue that's important to you, definitely exercise your voice through your vote. All right, Jen, did you have anything you wanted to throw in there or ask, or?
I think some people are familiar with the term of like coral reefs getting bleached, and I just didn't know if we wanted to mention that a little bit too. A lot of people like to take vacations and travel and go see lovely coral reefs, and so I just thought we'd throw that in as a last minute topic.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, so if we lost all the coral reefs due to bleaching and then they die off, it would cost us $1 trillion a year. They actually play a really important role. It's not just in supporting the ecosystems where they are. It also is because they dissipate a lot of the wave energy that happens when waves are propagating to the coast. So when an earthquake occurs and a tsunami is formed, if there's a coral reef in the way, it will dissipate a lot of that energy. There's also things like mangroves and other things that can buffer the impact, but without the impact of the coral reef standing in the way from harmful waves impinging upon the coast, there will be a lot more coastal damage. And so they are pretty important. I don't think that part of the coral reef story gets a lot of press. But coral reefs, yeah, so it would cost us $1 trillion, not only because of that damage, but because of tourism. People love them. They're beautiful. So they're one of the species affected, actually, by the increasing acidity in the ocean. So acidity and increasing temperatures causes coral bleaching. There are some coral species that are more resilient than others. And so that's one of the techniques that people have been using to try to get coral reefs to survive. They've been trying to selectively breed the ones that are more heat resistant. Like I believe there's one in the Red Sea that's more heat resistant. And then they are trying to use robots to try to disperse their larvae.
Yeah, they have a very unique and delicate reproductive process, right? Like once a year on a full moon, and I don't know, something crazy.
That was one thing.
That
was one thing that was just discovered, that actually some species try to spread their eggs multiple times a month, actually. And so that's another thing that could be genetically selected to try to help the survival of the reefs.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, there are a bunch of other tangents I've wanted to go on. I've probably gone on too many, but yeah, go ahead.
They're just fascinating to me. I actually got to go to the Great Barrier Reef 2 years ago, and it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life, not just because they're so beautiful, but just to learn about their impact on our world. They produce a lot of the oxygen in the planet, and if we lose them, then we'll lose a huge source of oxygen in the world. But just seeing the effect of climate change in real time, we got to see some that were alive, but there was a lot of bleaching happening, and there still is in those reefs. And just seeing the amount of life that depends on those, formations for as an ecosystem, it's really interesting. And then the dynamic between the reefs and the mangroves and the rainforest and how they all kind of work together and depend on each other was just fascinating. So when you hear about, climate change is killing the coral again, that's where that 1 or 2 degrees is so important, because that can really be the,
Yeah.
life or death factor for some of these life forms in
Yeah,
the
a
ocean.
lot of things in the ocean are just very sensitive relative to things in the atmosphere for the changes in temperature that we're used to. If you push it 1 more degree, might not be able to survive. I mean, there are already fish migrating. There was a study done 6 years ago, just showing all the directions and locations where certain types of fish tended to congregate relative to past times, and they found that they were moving to colder waters or more nutrient-rich ones, because just there wasn't as much productivity due to the more microscopic organisms that the fish fed off of. Here's a tangent, though, that I kind of wanted to mention earlier. It has to do with the loss of oxygen from the ocean. So that's due to a bunch of factors, and it's not directly related to acidification, but it actually compounds the effects on fish, because fish breathe oxygen, so it matters to them. But the ocean's steadily losing oxygen, and so the combination of acidity and oxygen is actually what's going to and also temperature. That's the triple threat: temperature, acidity, oxygen. That's what's going to impact the fisheries. It's not just acidification.
It's amazing that some animals are even still around with as many things as they've had to adapt to. Just one of those things is enough to, severely affect a lot of life forms, and they're dealing with 3 things at once, and it doesn't look, it's just steadily getting worse. So the fact that we still have a lot of these creatures is pretty impressive, but also shows that we don't have much time left.
Yeah. I mean, and to go back to why the ocean is important. I don't think I talked about why the ocean is a buffer. So the ocean, it's a change, and why there are such small numbers that are so important. So in the ocean, even though, so the 1.5 to 2 degrees, that's referring to the atmosphere at the surface. The ocean's going to change by less than that. And that's because of its mass, basically, or density, mass per unit volume. So it takes about 850 times more heat to raise the ocean by a degree temperature than the atmosphere. So the ocean's been taking up over 90% of the heat that's in excess. The atmosphere has been keeping very little of it. And so that way, the ocean's been buffering the temperature change that we experience. But those events, those coral bleaching events, those are actually due to these marine heat waves, where it's an unusually hot time in the ocean. They experience heat waves just like we do at the surface. And that's because of a bunch of that's one thing that a physical oceanographer studies, just how those heat waves occur. And the ocean also, not only does it take up so much heat and reduce the amount that the atmosphere is warming, but its circulation actually plays a role. Because its circulation is changing, and that's due to things like the ice melt and changing exchange between the atmosphere and ocean. That circulation change is actually expected to further buffer the rate at which climate changes. So the ocean is doing everything it can. And when there's these differences in temperature between the equator and the poles, that the differences are getting smaller because, as I was talking about, the Arctic is going to warm more than the equator. That actually is changing our weather systems that we experience. So that's another way that the ocean is going to impact someone who lives in the mountains in Colorado. So you know those deep freeze events during the winter, like this past one.
Polar vortexes.
Yeah, the polar vortex events.
Mm-hmm.
So the polar vortex, atmospheric scientists kind of get irked when people say it, just because they like being very specific. There are two polar vortices. There's the troposphere one, stratosphere one. The troposphere one is the one that we experience, but sea ice depletion and also the reduction in difference in temperature between the equator and poles, that contributes to disrupting the stratospheric one, and then that affects the one that we experience. So it's kind of this roundabout mechanism, but the ocean plays a pivotal role in it. Is what people think they're finding. So the ocean is a regulator, but it can't do everything to stop extremes from happening.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and something that you hear a lot about the effects of climate change is that it makes extreme weather events more extreme, and specifically the ocean has a lot to do with that, especially when you're looking at hurricanes and coastal areas, you know, the tsunamis and everything. But it's even, like you said, it affects things like polar vortexes, and that seems a little contradictory when you're talking about the planet's warming, but you're causing these insane cold events in the winter. Yeah. And that's a big argument that a lot of deniers have is, you know, well, we can't be, you know, warming the planet because look, it's winter and it's snowing. Like, that's not how it works, but
yeah, it's called the seasons.
Yeah, it's weather,
and it's also weather. So the one thing that climate scientists need to communicate very clearly is just the distinction between weather and climate, and I believe you've discussed that on your show. So, I mean, just to reiterate, it cannot be more important to kind of clear. I mean, weather is just an event. It's happening in the moment. Climate is when you think back on what happened over a long period of time. How did you feel about it? So it's kind of like that. It's the statistics. It's the average of the weather.
Long term, not short term.
Yeah. So yeah.
So what you're saying is I need to invest in whitewater rafting in Colorado and not ski lodges.
Right.
Just kidding.
Become a whitewater rafting instructor instead of a ski instructor. Yeah.
Yes. All right. Well, we're all moving to Denver, so get ready for us.
We're gonna get a villa on the mountaintop, which won't be cold for very long, but
no, I don't know. I guess it'd be nice if we could end on like a good note. Is there anything good happening? Like, are there things? I know we mentioned coral reefs are being rebuilt. Is there anything else that you've seen or that you've experienced that you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, yeah, this is always difficult for a climate. I mean, a climate scientist lives off of this depression, I guess. But Um,
We want to remain optimistic.
What
yes.
about, are there any causes or
Yeah.
groups that might be able to
this
help?
next generation, this upcoming generation seems like they're going to do better than we've done, or the people who came before us did. Um, I mean, Greta Thunberg, her movement, other movements, they're saying the right things. They're actually being paid attention to. There's also a study that shows that when children talk to their parents about climate change, the parents are actually more receptive, and the kids are actually some of the best communicators of anyone that the parents could listen to, because the parents, of course, care about their children. Like I was saying, with some of these top 5 reasons to do something about climate change, the number one reason was provide a better life for our children and grandchildren. And so, I mean, I gave the number one thing that you could do to reduce your impact on climate is prevent overpopulation. And so that seems a little contradictory as well. But so what are we saving the planet for, other species, our own species, if we're not going to save it for the next generation? So of course, people are going to have more children. We need that, but to go beyond the point where we can sustain the human population is a mistake. And I think that's ultimately what the movement in the 70s was all about. It wasn't so much about the climate change, though, and now climate change is just compounding upon that. I mean, the inequality between many developed countries and less developed countries has been decreasing over time. That's actually a great thing. But climate change has actually prevented that decrease from being as good as it would have been. So the gap is about 25% larger because of already what has changed about climate. And so that's disconcerting for countries that may not have the resources to adapt. I mean, it's comforting on one level that the U.S. Will be able to adapt, but it might be the haves that are able to best adapt, and the have-nots, the gap between them might be larger. And so that's another reason. That's actually what I think is one of the most important reasons to do something about changing climate, to not make the disenfranchised feel even worse. I mean, there's the climate gentrification issue with people on the coast. Like in Miami, people are being priced out in places that are elevated higher. Those are the more expensive places, and people are trying to figure out why, but it might be because of the perception that there's more flooding events, sea levels changing. So the have-nots would have to, they can only afford places in the low-lying areas which are going to be flooded more. So it's things like that we should do something about by stopping this changing climate.
Yeah, it's absolutely a social justice issue, and
Exactly.
I think there's plenty of studies out there that kind of support the notion that climate change disproportionately affects people in poverty and people of color, people without, like you said, access to a lot of the resources to fight this, which is unfair because it's the folks that have the resources that are causing a lot of it. So what are some organizations, nonprofits, resources that you would suggest people look into supporting, donating to, either their time or money, if they're able to help kind of fight climate change and or support the health of the oceans?
Well, so I know. I mean, on this topic of the inequality gap and also people needing to move and migrate. My wife and some friends are starting this organization. I just need to give a plug for it. Sin Fronteras Social Club, trying to just better support the people who have been displaced, either due to violence or possibly environmental changes. About 25% is environmental changes already. That might get worse. And so there are also the big organizations like Sierra Club, there's the Nature Conservancy, there's World Wildlife Funds. Those are all good. They're concerned about the oceans at this point, even if they were rooted in land conservation. But there's also specifically ocean ones like Oceana and the Ocean Conservancy. Those are all great. So those are the ones that are on my radar and minds that I would try to support.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we've mentioned a lot of tips during the show, reducing, your use of resources and aerosols, reproducing responsibly, flying less, using public transit, eating less meat, voting. These are all very actionable items, but also getting involved with organizations or lending your time and money to those organizations that are doing some of this work is another way you can make an impact as an individual, I think. Because exactly. These folks are doing this full time and this is their main focus. So yeah, those are some great options for people to look into supporting, and also look at your local community and see what environmental groups are there. You may not live by the ocean, but you may have groups that are doing things to reduce carbon emissions or educate the community. So
yeah, I think there's also this climate lobby, CCL,
Citizens Climate Lobby.
Citizens Climate Lobby. Yeah. You're right. Yeah, so that organization forms because of this tax and dividend, or the fee and dividend. I'm forgetting names at this point in the day, but I think it's the fee and dividend bill. I think it was drafted by Deutsch in the House, a representative, and so the idea behind that is that we effectively tax people who are using carbon a lot, emitting it, and but the people who are not doing so much of that actually get a dividend in the end, so that the wealth is redistributed. And I think that is one of the smartest ways to go about this solving climate change, precisely for the social justice reasons that we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. The CCL, I've looked into them. They're very organized. They're bipartisan, so they reach out to both sides of the aisle. They have a climate caucus that they actually require for every Democrat that joins, a Republican has to join. So they will only take them in pairs. Yeah. And they have weekly calls with their volunteers. They really educate people and give you the tools to go talk to your elected officials and your community. So it is a great organization, and thank you for bringing that up. For those looking to get involved at that level, or just learn more about the work they're doing. All right. Anything else that we didn't talk about before we move on to our green life hacks?
Well, there's so much to talk about, but we don't have the time. Sorry.
Maybe we'll do a follow-up episode next year sometime if we think of another topic. All right. Well, thank you so much for all of that information. You've given us a lot to think about. And with that, I think we're going to go on to our green life hack. So I guess I'll start. In honor of the topic today, I actually was going to show my coral safe sunscreen. I don't know if you can see the little container, but this is a brand called All Good. There's several brands out there, but I like this one because it's in a metal container, not plastic, and it's reef friendly, which means it does not contain some of the chemicals that are known to harm coral reefs. And I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but when you're looking at sunscreens, the thing to look for is no oxybenzone and octinazate. Did I say that right? Those are the two big culprits, I think, when it comes to harming coral. So there are a lot of lines out there. They are a little more expensive, but you know, it's worth it to help the planet, to help our coral. We've just discussed why they're so important. So that is my green life hack for today. Check out some coral safe sunscreen. Jen, what do you have for us?
Well, I have made my own sunscreen, but I think we talked about that at previous shows. If not, there's plenty of recipes out there. You can make your own if you don't want to buy. I think we've shown plenty of these before, but I didn't have anything else fancy or exciting. So this is just my reusable metal stainless steel straw. I know straws have gotten a lot of, recent, I don't know, news about all of the plastics in the ocean. And there's a lot of restaurants in San Antonio where I live that are, not giving out straws. And if they do, they're, paper or something like that. So anyways, I just have this. I carry it around with me wherever I go. So if I need a straw, I have it.
You're helping the turtles.
Yep.
Other fish or other wildlife.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Trossman, do you have a green life hack for us? I know you've given us a lot of things during the show, but if you have anything else you want to add.
So I use a bamboo toothbrush.
Awesome.
So just trying to reduce the amount of plastic in the ocean. I guess we never touched upon that. There's a cost associated with it. What is it? I have it. I have it here, right here. Well, I think I remember something like it's. Oh, I do have it right here. It's 25 billion to 250 billion per year additional on top of the 500 billion to 5 trillion per year.
Is this pounds?
We've already cost
or money
ourselves.
Okay.
So the reason why it costs something is that it's killing ecosystems, and there's loss of tourism. So you've probably seen pictures of some Caribbean beaches with a lot of trash piled up on it. It's things like that. They're losing tourism.
Does that take? That doesn't even take into account the health issues caused by people eating said plastic in their fish.
Yeah,
which is gross.
So that part is unknown so far, and that's why there's such a wide range. It's 500 billion to 5 trillion. It's an order of magnitude. And that's because people are not quite certain about what the health impacts are going to be. And they're actually not quite certain about the extent to which the ecosystems have been impacted, I believe. So plastic output into the ocean is an important issue, but it is very separate from the climate change topic. It's just, I mean, it's something that our behavior is causing, but actually, so another green life hack is you have to decide on a good balance between plastics that are reusable versus biodegradable and cotton-based things like tote bags. Because tote bags, you have to use them an unbelievable amount of times in order to offset the carbon emissions that it took to make them. relative to just producing a plastic bag. So plastic bags take less carbon emissions, but then you're putting plastic into the ocean, most likely. So it's a difficult choice until this biodegradable and reusable stuff came along. Reusable plastic bags may actually be and biodegradable ones, depending upon the application. Like for garbage bags, biodegradable. For grocery bags, maybe reusable plastic. That might actually be the most green way to go. As long as you don't put that reusable plastic bag in the garbage and put it out into the ocean, I guess. But,
Yeah. Lots of things to consider when you're trying to make the switch. It's not always, like you said, as cut and dry as just stop using plastic, but there are good alternatives. Like you said, your bamboo toothbrush, the metal straw. There's lots of things we can do as consumers when we're buying things to, just try to reduce where we can. So awesome. Well, where can we find you online, Jen? Are you online anywhere you'd like to promote?
No, not right now, but
Okay. Exclusively here on
yes,
Sustainably Geeky.
yes.
Awesome. Dr. Trossman, would you like to promote yourself online or any causes that you're championing right now?
well, just that Sin Fronteras social club. Find them on Instagram, Facebook, GoFund, I believe, if they're not already there. It's pretty new. And so I don't know what I'm championing yet, I guess, but the principle is very good. Yeah, I think you should follow organizations like NASA, American Geophysical Union, National Geographic, places like that on Instagram, more than following me. But I mean, you could see some things that I thought were strange about Austin. If you really want to follow me, I'm L Juxmex.
Okay.
Jewish, Mexican, Texan.
Awesome. Well, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Het's Gonna Be Me. And of course, you can find the show wherever you listen to podcasts. We are on Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube if you want to watch us. And then, of course, we have a Facebook page, and we are now on Instagram and Twitter as well. So follow us for tips and interesting reposts on both of those channels. And then Facebook, of course, send us your ideas or your comments about shows. We'd love to hear what you like about us, what you would like to hear more of. We really appreciate you listening, and if you subscribe to us, please give us a 5-star rating to help other people find us, and definitely share our show as well. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.